I'm Kelsey, 23 years old, and 2 weeks ago, I collapsed on stage in front of 3,000 people. On the day I was supposed to give the valedictorian speech at the New York Academy of Design, the doctor said I had a brain tumor. They needed to operate immediately. They called my parents, but no one answered. 3 days later, when I finally woke up, surrounded by beeping machines and intravenous tubes, the first thing I saw wasn't my family's worried faces. It was an Instagram post from my sister, Cassandra. The whole family was smiling at a resort in the Maldives with the caption, "Family Trip." Finally, no stress, no drama. The physical pain of the surgery was nothing compared to the realization that I had been erased from my own family's life. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Have you ever been a ghost in your own home? Drop a comment and let me know your story, and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I stared at the screen of my phone, which showed 65 missed calls from Gregory, the man I was supposed to call my father. My vision was still slightly blurred from the medication, the hospital room smelling of antiseptic, and silence, but his latest text message was crystal clear. It said, "We need you. Answer immediately." I didn't feel a surge of warmth or relief that they had finally reached out after I had nearly slipped away on an operating table. Instead, I felt the clinical coldness of an architect looking at a structural failure. I knew they didn't need me. They needed the digital blueprints for the Sterling Heights project, which was the only contract keeping Gregory's failing architecture firm above water. For years, I had been the silent investor in their version of family, providing the labor, the grades, and the talent, while they overdrafted my compassion for years. Now, I realized it had been a subscription service, with me footing the bill while they enjoyed the rewards. My father hadn't called the hospital to check if I was breathing, and he hadn't asked the surgeons if I survived the 4-hour operation to remove the mass from my brain. He was only worried about a contract deadline. My mother, Stephanie, hadn't sent a single message asking if I was scared. They were too busy taking filtered photos of their tropical paradise, celebrating a life that I had built for them with my own exhaustion. I didn't cry, and I didn't ask why they weren't there. I just reached for my laptop, which my friend Courtney had left on the hospital tray table. My fingers were still numb from the intravenous lines, and my head throbbed with the rhythmic, pulsing pain, but my mind had never been sharper. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. This wasn't a mental breakdown. It was a balance sheet, and it was time to settle the accounts. I logged into the project cloud, my face illuminated by the harsh blue light of the screen. With 3 deliberate clicks, I revoked Gregory's administrative access to my private servers. Then, I initiated a total wipe of the local cache. The Sterling Heights blueprints, the work of 2,000 hours, and my own architectural genius vanished from their reach in an instant. Every line, every calculated measurement, and every innovation that was supposed to save my father's reputation was gone. I sat back against the thin hospital pillows and watched the access denied notification pop up on the screen. Inside that sterile room, my laptop glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. They weren't shocked by what they had done to me. They were about to be shocked that I had finally stopped playing along. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrawn for the last time. The account was closed. The rhythmic hiss of the oxygen machine became the background track to my accounting. I sat in the dim light of the hospital room, the taste of copper still lingering in my mouth from the surgery, and I opened the mental ledger I had been keeping for 22 years. For 4 years, I had convinced myself that my exhaustion was a badge of honor, a price I was willing to pay for a seat at the table of a family that never actually wanted me there. I looked at my hands, the skin pale and mapped with needle marks, and I remembered the smell of burnt espresso and old dishwater that had defined my college experience. While I was pulling double shifts at a coffee shop downtown, scrubbing counters until my joints ached just to cover my rent and books, my sister Cassandra was living a different reality. Every semester, like clockwork, Gregory and Stephanie would write a check for $62,500 to cover her tuition, her sorority fees, and her lifestyle expenses. Over 4 years, that totaled $250,000. It was money that Gregory had told me didn't exist when I asked for help with my first-year housing. He had looked me in the eye and said the business was tight, that I was smart and capable and could figure it out on my own. I believed him. I took it as a compliment, not a disposal. But the ledger didn't stop at tuition. Lying there, with the blue light of the laptop reflecting in my pupils, I recalled the day 6 months ago when I had found the paper in Gregory's home office while I was helping him organize his files. It was a loan application for $500,000, a commercial line of credit intended to keep his firm's doors open during the dry spell. My heart had stopped when I saw the co-borrower line. It wasn't Stephanie's name. It was mine. My father had used my rising reputation in the New York architecture scene, my clean credit history, and my professional license to anchor a $500,000 anchor around my neck. He hadn't asked. He had simply forged my signature, knowing I was too busy working 3 jobs and finishing my thesis to ever look at the family's financial support documents. This was the invisible chain I had been dragging. People often ask why a victim stays in an abusive situation, and why they don't just walk away the moment the first blow is struck, even if that blow is financial or emotional. They don't understand the concept of a house without songbirds. It's called learned helplessness. For years, my parents had systematically dismantled my self-worth, convincing me that my only value lay in my utility. I was the backup plan, the safety net, the one who handled the stress and drama so they could enjoy their Maldives sunsets in peace. I had been conditioned to believe that if I just worked a little harder, designed a little better, or stayed a little quieter, the love I craved would finally be deposited into my account. It was a house built on sand, a structure with a fatal flaw. They had spent my $250,000 education fund on Cassandra's designer wardrobe and Gregory's vanity projects. They had gambled $500,000 of my future on a firm that was hemorrhaging money. And then, when the pressure in my brain became too much and I collapsed, they looked at the problem I had become and decided I wasn't worth the cost of a plane ticket home. I looked at the screen again. The access denied message for Gregory's firm felt like the first honest thing in my life. This wasn't a daughter being petty. This was an architect condemned by a building that was never meant to stand. I had been the scapegoat, the silent partner in my own destruction. But sitting in that hospital bed, I finally realized that the chains weren't made of steel, they were made of my own need for their approval. And that need had died on the operating table. The ledger was open, the numbers were clear, and Gregory Henderson was about to find out that his cash cow had finally left the pasture. The heavy hospital doors didn't swing open. They burst. My mother, Stephanie, walked in first, followed by Gregory and Cassandra. They didn't smell like the hospital's sterile soap. They smelled like expensive sunblock and the salt air of the Maldives. Gregory didn't even look at the bandage wrapping my head. He didn't ask the nurse about my vitals. He walked straight to my bed and threw a leather-bound folder onto my lap, right over my bruised thighs. "Fix it," he barked. "I tried to log in this morning from the tarmac. The servers are locked, my engineers are standing by at the firm, and we have exactly 6 hours before the client pulls the contract." I looked at the folder, then at his face, which was tan and flushed with anger. "I had a mass removed from my brain, Gregory," I said, my voice like dry leaves. "I'm not an IT consultant. I'm a post-operative patient." Cassandra leaned against the wall, scrolling through her phone, probably checking the engagement on her latest vacation post. "Oh, stop being so dramatic, Kelsey," she said without looking up. "The doctors told us the tumor was benign. You're fine. You just couldn't handle the fact that the entire family was focused on my vacation and my career for once, so you had to stage a little collapse on stage." "A stunt?" I whispered. The monitor beside my bed began to beep faster, tracking my rising heart rate. I collapsed in front of 3,000 people because a tumor was crushing my frontal lobe. "You're not dying now," my mother snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut through the hum of the intravenous pump. "But your father's business is. Do you have any idea how much that Maldives trip cost? We needed this celebration. We earned it after dealing with your constant moodiness for 4 years. "Sign the papers," Gregory ordered, pointing at the folder. It was a formal transfer of the Sterling Heights intellectual property to his firm, including a waiver stating I would never seek royalties or professional credit. "If you don't, I'm cutting you off. And I'm not just talking about the family. I'll make sure every architectural firm in New York knows you're unreliable." And that $500,000 loan, the one you're a co-borrower on, if the firm goes under, that debt stays with you. You'll be 23 years old with $500,000 in debt and no career. I stared at him, the man who had forged my signature to save his own skin, now using that crime as a knife against my throat. He wasn't a father, he was a kidnapper, and he was holding my future for ransom. Get out, I said. It wasn't a scream, it was a verdict. What did you say? Gregory took a step closer, his shadow looming over my bed. I said, get out, I repeated. You have exactly 60 seconds to leave this room before I press the call button and tell the security guard that 3 trespassers are harassing a post-operative patient. And as for the blueprints, they're gone. I didn't just lock the server, I initiated a total wipe of the local cache. You have nothing. The silence that followed was absolute. My mother's mouth fell open, and for the first time, Cassandra actually looked up from her phone. They weren't shocked by their own cruelty. They were shocked that I had finally stopped playing the part of the silent victim. Gregory was still vibrating with rage, his hands curled into fists as he loomed over my hospital bed. He was the man who had supposedly provided for me for 22 years, yet all I saw now was a parasite that had run out of hosts. He opened his mouth to deliver another threat, but the words died in his throat as the heavy door opened with a deliberate, authoritative thud. Grandpa Thomas walked in. He was 80 years old, but his posture was straight as a rod, and he carried an aura that made even the medical monitors in the room seem to quiet down. His eyes weren't on me. They were fixed on Gregory with a look of bone-deep, icy disappointment. Behind him stood a distinguished man in a sharp charcoal suit holding a leather briefcase. I recognized him immediately. It was Thomas's lead counsel. "Sit down, Gregory," Thomas said. The command was soft, but it hit the room like a physical weight. Gregory, the man who had been screaming at a post-operative patient seconds ago, actually hesitated before obeying. He slumped into the plastic guest chair, his tan face suddenly losing its Maldives glow. "I have been the watchman of this family for far too long," Thomas began, walking to the side of my bed and resting a hand on my shoulder. His skin was paper thin, but his grip was steady. "I stayed silent while I watched you take the $250,000 I gave you for Kelsey's education and use it to buy Cassandra's designer bags and fund your own vanity projects. I watched you forge her name on a $500,000 loan, gambling her future on your own failures. I stayed quiet because I was a coward, Gregory. I was a father who desperately hoped his son would eventually find his soul again and remember what it means to protect his own." This was the watchman's silent regret. For years, Thomas had been caught between hope and the truth, trapped between the fading hope that his son would change and the cold reality that his granddaughter was being systematically destroyed. He told me later that my collapse on that stage was his final deadline. Seeing Gregory choose a Maldives resort over a daughter and emergency brain surgery had finally broken the last string of Thomas's patience. He had been watching the fire consume me for years, and he realized that if he didn't act now, there would be nothing left but ash. "Your grandmother, the woman who built the foundation of everything you currently own, left a legacy," Thomas continued, signaling his lawyer to open the briefcase. "She called it the heritage of fire. It was meant for the child who possessed her spirit, the one who worked while others played. She knew, even before you did, that blood doesn't make a family. Character does. This trust is worth $5 million. It was established 22 years ago, and it has been growing ever since. It bypasses you entirely, Gregory. It belongs solely to Kelsey." Gregory's eyes flared with a sudden, ugly greed. $5 million? Dad, we can use that to save the firm. We can pay off the loan and... "You will touch nothing," Thomas interrupted, his voice turning to ice. "As of 8 o'clock this morning, you have been terminated from your position as the director of the family estate. I have revoked your power of attorney, canceled your corporate credit cards, and filed a motion to have you removed from the board of directors. You wanted to play the high-stakes game of choosing a vacation over a dying child. Well, you won the prize. You're unemployed, Gregory, and you will never see a penny of this. $5 million. Gregory looked at me, then at the lawyer, realizing the tower of lies he'd built was finally collapsing. He had spent years treating me like a ghost, an invisible resource to be mined. Now he was the one being erased. The power flip was absolute. He wasn't the provider anymore. He was just a disgraced man with a tan and a ruined reputation, standing in the shadow of a daughter he had underestimated for the last time. Thomas's lawyer, Marcus, stepped forward, his eyes as sharp as the crease in his trousers. He didn't look like a man here for a conversation. He looked like a man here for an execution. Gregory was still sputtering, trying to find a way to claim that he was being persecuted, but Marcus simply reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single laminated sheet of paper. "Gregory, we didn't just look at the bank statements," Marcus said, his voice flat and clinical. "We subpoenaed the records from your family's group insurance policy. Specifically, the diagnostic report from 60 days ago." I watched my father's face. The tan he'd brought back from the Maldives didn't just fade, it curdled. He tried to reach for the paper, but Thomas stepped between them, his presence like a stone wall. "You had an insurance physical 2 months ago, Kelsey," Marcus continued, looking at me with a soft, brief flash of pity before turning back to Gregory. "Because it was a group policy, the primary account holder, your father, received the preliminary notifications. He got a digital alert stating that your blood work and initial scans showed a significant abnormality in the frontal lobe. It recommended an immediate follow-up with a neurosurgeon." The room went cold. I felt the air leave my lungs. "You knew?" I whispered. The heart monitor began a frantic, jagged rhythm. 60 days ago, you knew something was wrong with my brain?" "I thought it was an error," Gregory stammered, his voice rising in a desperate pitch. "Scans have false positives all the time. You were working, you were fine. I didn't want to worry you during finals." "You didn't want to worry her?" Thomas roared, the sound echoing off the stair walls. "Or you didn't want her to stop working on the Sterling Heights project? You knew your business was dying, and you decided to gamble your daughter's life for a signature on a blueprint." Marcus wasn't finished. He pulled out a second document. "Then there's the matter of the $500,000 commercial loan. We hired a forensic document examiner yesterday morning. The signature on the co-borrow line for that line of credit is a total fabrication. Gregory, you forged your daughter's name while she was in a library finishing a thesis. This was the kill shot. It removed any remaining path to redemption for the people standing at the foot of my bed. They weren't just ungrateful or biased. They were criminals. This wasn't a family disagreement anymore. It was identity theft, insurance fraud, and criminal negligence." Gregory sank back into his chair, the leather folder from earlier sliding off his lap and hitting the floor with a hollow thud. Stephanie was shaking her head, looking at the ceiling as if waiting for a miracle that wasn't coming. "The district attorney's office has already been notified," Marcus stated, closing his briefcase with a final, metallic snap. "This isn't a negotiation about blueprints or servers. This is a criminal referral. You won't be going back to Maldives, Gregory. You'll be lucky if you aren't going to a state penitentiary." I looked at my father and felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, not even a spark of pity. I just rubbed my eyes, trying to summon a shred of regret for the man who had supposedly raised me, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a family falling apart. It was a structural failure that had been hidden for 22 years. The accounts were finally settled. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the clinical rhythm of my heart monitor. My parents didn't look like the architects of my misery anymore. They looked like the debris of a collapsed structure. 2 weeks after I was discharged from the hospital, they showed up at the door of my small, one-bedroom apartment. They didn't come with flowers or an apology. They came because the bank had initiated foreclosure on their home, and Gregory was facing 5 to 10 years in a state penitentiary for identity theft and insurance fraud. Stephanie collapsed onto the floor, her expensive designer coat dragging in the dust of my hallway. "Kelsey, please," she sobbed, the tears finally real because they were for her own survival. "We're losing everything. If you don't drop the charges, your father will die in prison. Think about the family." I didn't feel the familiar pull of guilt. I looked at the two people who had gambled my life for a signature on a blueprint and felt the absolute peace of a finished project. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "I already made a decision about the family legacy," I said, my voice cold and measured. I handed them a receipt for $250,000. I donated the exact amount of my stolen education fund to the New York Shelter for Victims of Domestic Abuse. I made the donation in your names. This is the only legacy you have left. Gregory looked at the receipt, his hands shaking. He realized then that I wasn't his cash cow anymore. I was the person holding the eviction notice to his entire existence. Goodbye, Gregory. Goodbye, Stephanie, I said, and I closed the door. The fallout was absolute. Gregory was sentenced to 3 years for fraud. Stephanie moved into a small, subsidized apartment in a rough neighborhood, isolated from the social circles she had spent her life trying to impress. Cassandra's engagement to her fiance Tyler collapsed after his family heard about the hospital abandonment. Last I heard, she was working 2 retail jobs just to cover her credit card debt. As for me, I didn't just survive, I thrived. I used the $5 million Heritage of Fire to establish the Eleanor Architecture Fund. We provide scholarships and legal support for talented students who are being financially exploited by their families. This is the justice of the sower. I stopped wasting my energy trying to keep people warm who only wanted to see me burn. Instead, I used the ashes of my old life to plant something beautiful. I am no longer a ghost in someone else's house. I am Kelsey Henderson, and for the first time in my life, I am exactly where I'm supposed to be. The success and peace you build are the only answers that matter to those who try to keep you small. If you believe that your value is something you define, not something you earn from people who don't see you, share this story. Don't let yourself be a ghost in your own life.